What does it mean to truly know something? To understand not just what exists, but why it exists, how it came to be, and what purpose it serves in the grand tapestry of reality. 24 centuries ago, in the bustling streets of ancient Athens, a young man named Aristotle began asking questions that would fundamentally reshape how humanity thinks about thinking itself. This is not merely the story of one philosopher. This is the story of how a single mind became the foundation upon which Western civilization built its understanding of logic, ethics, politics, science, and the very nature of existence. Aristotle didn't just observe the world. He created the intellectual tools we still use to comprehend it. But here's what makes his story extraordinary. Aristotle was wrong about many things, spectacularly, fundamentally wrong. Yet his method of being wrong was so sophisticated, so systematic, that it taught us more about truth than most people's correct answers ever could. The student who would surpass his master reconstruction of Plato's Academy. Young students in animated discussion Athens, 367 BCE. 17-year-old Aristotle arrives at Plato's Academy, carrying with him the intellectual hunger of a provincial youth from Stagira and the practical mindset of someone whose father served as physician to the Macedonian court. He enters a world of pure ideas, where his teacher Plato insists that reality as we perceive it is merely shadows dancing on a cave wall. For 20 years, Aristotle will wrestle with this vision. Plato taught that perfect forms exist in a realm beyond our physical world, that somewhere beyond the material universe lies the perfect circle, the ideal good, the true beautiful. Everything we encounter here is merely an imperfect copy of these eternal templates. But Aristotle's physician's son instincts rebel against this otherworldly focus. He watches ants building their colonies, observes the precise patterns of flower petals, studies the behavior of dolphins in the Aegean Sea. The natural world isn't a pale shadow of some perfect realm. It pulses with its own inherent logic, its own magnificent complexity. This tension between student and teacher represents one of history's most productive intellectual conflicts. Plato pulls toward the eternal and unchanging. Aristotle gravitates toward the temporal and dynamic. Where Plato sees imperfect copies, Aristotle sees individual substances with their own integrity and purpose. Consider this revolutionary shift. Instead of asking, "What perfect form does this tree imitate?" Aristotle asks, "What makes this tree specifically a tree? What is its essential nature, and how does it fulfill its potential?" This isn't just a different question. It's a fundamentally different way of approaching reality. The break, when it comes, is philosophical rather than personal. Plato dies in 347 BCE, and Aristotle, now 37, leaves Athens. He's not ready to simply inherit his master's system. He needs to build his own understanding from the ground up. The biological foundation of knowledge, marine life, detailed biological illustrations, microscopic imagery. Aristotle spends the next few years on the island of Lesbos, and something extraordinary happens. Away from the Academy's abstract debates, he becomes perhaps history's first systematic biologist. He dissects hundreds of animals, catalogs their parts, observes their behaviors, traces their life cycles. This isn't mere curiosity. Aristotle is developing a new method of understanding, one that begins with careful observation of what actually exists, rather than logical deduction from abstract principles. He dissects sharks and discovers they give birth to live young rather than laying eggs. He studies the development of chicken embryos day by day, documenting how complex structures emerge from apparent simplicity. But here's the crucial insight that separates Aristotle from a mere cataloger of facts. He realizes that living things reveal something fundamental about how reality itself works. Every organism has a nature, an internal principle that guides its development toward a specific end. The acorn doesn't randomly become anything, it becomes an oak tree because that's its inherent potential, its telos or purpose. This biological insight becomes the foundation for Aristotle's entire philosophy. If individual living things have natures and purposes, perhaps everything in reality operates according to similar principles. Perhaps the universe itself is less like Plato's geometric perfection and more like a vast, interconnected ecosystem where each element has its own nature and role to play. Watch how this transforms his approach to knowledge. Instead of starting with abstract definitions and reasoning downward to particular cases, Aristotle starts with careful observation of particular things and reasons upward to general principles. He invents what we now call the scientific method, though he wouldn't recognize our modern distinction between science and philosophy. The animals he studies teach him that knowledge isn't about escaping the physical world, but about understanding it more deeply. The dolphin's sophisticated social behavior, the bee's complex dances, the bird's navigation abilities all reveal that intelligence and purpose permeate nature at every level. The tutor and the future conqueror Macedonian court, young Alexander, maps showing the extent of his future empire. In 343 BCE, Philip II of Macedon makes a request that will reshape world history. Would Aristotle tutor his 13-year-old son, Alexander? The philosopher accepts, beginning a relationship that illustrates the complex dance between ideas and power, between contemplation and action. For 3 years, Aristotle educates the future Alexander the Great. What does the world's most systematic thinker teach the boy who will become history's most successful conqueror? The details remain largely mysterious, but we can see the influence in Alexander's later actions. Aristotle instills in Alexander a passion for inquiry that goes far beyond military strategy. When Alexander conquers new territories, he doesn't just extract tribute, he catalogs plants and animals, studies local customs, preserves libraries, sends specimens and cultural artifacts back to his former tutor. Alexander's empire becomes, in part, a vast research expedition that feeds Aristotle's systematic study of the world. But there's a deeper connection between teacher and student that reveals something essential about Aristotelian philosophy. Both believe that excellence, arete, comes through the actualization of potential. For Alexander, this means fulfilling his potential as a leader and warrior. For Aristotle, it means fulfilling humanity's potential for understanding and wisdom. Yet this relationship also reveals the tensions in Aristotle's thinking. His tutor teaches about the importance of the polis, the city-state, as the natural political unit where humans can flourish. But his student creates an empire that dissolves the boundaries between Greek and barbarian, fundamentally transforming the political landscape Aristotle considers natural and permanent. The irony is profound. Aristotle develops a philosophy, emphasizing the importance of understanding the natural limits and proper functions of things, while his most famous student systematically transcends every limit the ancient world thought permanent. Return to Athens. The Lyceum years begin. The Lyceum. Covered walkways. Students engaged in peripatetic discussions. 335 BCE. Aristotle returns to Athens, now 50 years old and intellectually mature, but he doesn't simply take over Plato's academy. Instead, he establishes his own school, the Lyceum, and with it, creates what may be history's first research university. The Lyceum is revolutionary in its organization. Unlike the academy's focus on mathematical and philosophical speculation, Aristotle's school combines theoretical investigation with empirical research. Students don't just debate abstract questions. They collect biological specimens, study political constitutions, analyze literary works, investigate the properties of materials. Aristotle develops his famous habit of teaching while walking, the peripatetic method. As he and his students stroll through the Lyceum's covered walkways, they engage in a unique form of collaborative thinking. Movement seems to stimulate thought, and the informal setting encourages the kind of open-ended inquiry that becomes Aristotle's trademark. But perhaps most importantly, the Lyceum becomes a place where Aristotle can pursue his grand project, the systematic classification and analysis of all knowledge. He's not content to specialize in one area. Instead, he wants to understand how all forms of knowledge relate to each other, how they can be organized into a coherent system that captures the full complexity of reality. This is where Aristotle becomes not just a philosopher, but the founder of multiple disciplines. He's simultaneously creating logic, ethics, political theory, biology, physics, psychology, literary criticism, and metaphysics. Each investigation informs the others, creating a unified intellectual vision that won't be matched for comprehensiveness until perhaps the emergence of modern systems theory. The Lyceum years represent Aristotle at the height of his powers. He's old enough to have synthesized decades of learning, young enough to pursue new investigations with tireless energy. The works that will influence Western thought for 2 millennia are taking shape in those covered walkways, through those walking conversations that blend rigorous analysis with wonder at the complexity of existence. The architecture of thought, the invention of logic, geometric patterns, logical diagrams, ancient Greek mathematical proofs before Aristotle. Humans reasoned. After Aristotle, they understood the rules by which reasoning works. This isn't just a technical achievement, it's one of the most profound revolutions in human intellectual history. Aristotle didn't just use logic, he invented it as a formal discipline, creating the tools that make systematic knowledge possible. Consider what this means. Every valid argument you've ever constructed, every scientific hypothesis you've evaluated, every mathematical proof you've followed, all of these depend on principles that Aristotle first identified and systematized. He created the intellectual DNA of rational thought itself. The syllogism is his most famous invention, but its significance goes far beyond its mechanical application. When Aristotle formulates, "All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal," he's not just showing how to construct a valid argument. He's revealing something fundamental about the relationship between universal principles and particular cases. But here's what makes Aristotelian logic truly revolutionary. He realizes that the form of an argument is independent of its content. Whether we're reasoning about mathematics, ethics, politics, or biology, the same logical structures apply. This insight makes possible what we now call systematic knowledge, understanding that can be tested, verified, and built upon across different domains. Aristotle identifies what he calls the three acts of the mind: simple apprehension, understanding concepts; judgment, combining concepts into propositions; and reasoning, drawing conclusions from propositions. This isn't just an abstract analysis. It's a practical guide to clear thinking that remains relevant 24 centuries later. Consider the sophistication of his approach to contradiction. The law of non-contradiction, that something cannot both be and not be the same thing in the same way at the same time, seems obvious. But Aristotle realizes that this principle can't be proven because it's the foundation that makes all proof possible. You can't step outside logic to justify logic. You can only show that anyone who denies this principle must use it in the very act of denial. This metalogical insight, understanding the conditions that make logical thought possible, represents a kind of philosophical maturity that few thinkers have achieved. Aristotle doesn't just give us tools for reasoning, he explains why these tools work and what their limitations are. But perhaps most importantly, Aristotelian logic isn't merely formal manipulation of symbols. It's grounded in his understanding of reality itself. The structures of correct reasoning mirror the structures of existence because both reflect the way things actually are related to each other in the world. The science of being, metaphysics, abstract representations of substance and essence, philosophical diagrams, cosmic imagery. What is the most fundamental question we can ask about reality? Aristotle's answer shapes the entire Western philosophical tradition. What does it mean for something to be? This isn't just curiosity. It's the question that must be answered before we can have reliable knowledge about anything else. Aristotle calls this inquiry first philosophy, what later scholars term metaphysics. It's the attempt to understand being qua being, existence as such, the basic structures that make reality intelligible. This investigation leads him to insights so fundamental that we're still working out their implications. His central discovery is the concept of substance, ousia in Greek. Individual things like this tree, this horse, this human being are primary substances because they exist independently and serve as the subjects for all other properties and relations. Everything else, qualities, quantities, relations, actions, exists only as modifications of these basic, substantial entities. This seems straightforward until you realize its radical implications. Plato thought the most real things were abstract forms that particular objects merely imitated. But Aristotle argues that concrete individuals are more real than the universals we predicate of them. The universal treeness doesn't exist somewhere beyond particular trees. It exists only in and through the individual trees that actualize it. But how do we understand what makes something the particular substance it is? This leads to Aristotle's famous distinction between matter and form, hylomorphism. Everything material is composed of matter, hyl, organized by form, morphe. But form isn't just external shape. It's the organizing principle that makes something what it is and enables it to do what it does. Consider a living organism. Its matter is the physical materials that compose it, but its form is the life principle that organizes those materials into a functioning whole. The form isn't separate from the matter. It's the way the matter is organized to constitute this particular kind of being. This leads to one of Aristotle's most profound insights: the relationship between actuality, energeia, and potentiality, dynamis. Every substance has both what it actually is now and what it potentially could become. The acorn is actually an acorn, but potentially an oak tree. Change happens when potential becomes actual under the right conditions. But here's where Aristotle's metaphysics becomes truly sophisticated. He realizes that pure potentiality without any actuality would be nothing at all, mere possibility with no ground in reality. And pure actuality without any potentiality would be static, unchanging, perfect. This analysis leads him to posit the existence of what he calls the unmoved mover, pure actuality that serves as the ultimate source of all change and development in the universe. This isn't quite the personal God of later theology, but it's not merely an impersonal force either. It's thought thinking itself, the perfect intellectual activity that attracts all other beings toward their own actualization. The entire cosmos moves because it loves this perfect being, striving to imitate its pure actuality within the limits of material existence. The four causes, understanding change and purpose. Craftspeople at work, natural processes of growth, architectural construction, why does anything happen? This question leads Aristotle to perhaps his most practical and influential insight, the theory of the four causes. But causes here doesn't mean what we usually think. Aristotle isn't just asking what makes things happen. He's asking what makes things intelligible, what allows us to truly understand any process or entity. The four causes are four different ways of answering the question, why? And together they provide a complete account of anything that exists or occurs. Let's consider them through a concrete example, the creation of a bronze statue. The material cause is what something is made from, in our case, the bronze. But knowing the material doesn't tell us much about the statue itself. The same bronze could become a sword, a mirror, or a cooking pot. The material is necessary but not sufficient for understanding. The formal cause is the structure, pattern, or design, the actual shape and proportions that make this bronze into a statue rather than something else. This is closer to what makes the statue what it is, but still incomplete. The efficient cause is what brings about the change, the sculptor's activity, the tools used, the process of molding and shaping. This is what we usually mean by cause in modern usage, but Aristotle sees it as only one aspect of complete explanation. The final cause is the purpose or end toward which the process aims, perhaps to honor a god, commemorate a hero, or beautify a public space. This is what gives meaning to the entire enterprise and explains why this particular statue came to exist rather than some other artifact. Now, here's what's revolutionary about this analysis. Aristotle insists that all four causes are necessary for complete understanding, and in living things, the formal, efficient, and final causes often coincide. The form of an oak tree is also the end toward which the acorn develops, and this same form serves as the efficient cause guiding the development process. This means that nature is inherently teleological, purpose-driven. The acorn doesn't accidentally become an oak. It develops toward this end because that's its nature, its built-in direction of development. The bird doesn't randomly build any structure. It constructs precisely the kind of nest appropriate for its species because that's what serves the end of successful reproduction. But Aristotle's teleology isn't imposed from outside by some external designer. It's immanent, built into the very nature of things. Each substance has its own internal principle of development that guides it toward the actualization of its specific form of excellence. This understanding transforms how we think about knowledge itself. To truly understand anything, we need to grasp not just its material composition and the processes that formed it, but also its internal structure and the end or purpose it serves. Science without teleology gives us mechanism without meaning. Teleology without careful empirical study gives us speculation without substance. The four causes become the foundation for Aristotle's approach to every domain of inquiry. Whether he's analyzing political constitutions, tragic dramas, ethical virtues, or biological organisms, he consistently asks, what is this made of? What is its structure? How did it come to be? What purpose does it serve? These questions remain central to serious inquiry in fields as diverse as engineering, psychology, ecology, and organizational theory. The good life, ethics, and human flourishing. What makes life worth living? Visual, ancient Greek daily life, people engaged in various activities, philosophical discussions, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. With these opening words of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle begins the most influential investigation of human flourishing ever written. But he's not asking what we ought to do. He's asking something more fundamental. What kind of life is worth living for a human being? This approach revolutionizes moral philosophy. Instead of starting with rules or duties, Aristotle begins with a simple observation. Humans act purposefully. Everything we do for the sake of something we consider good. But this raises the crucial question. Is there some ultimate good for the sake of which we do everything else? Aristotle's answer is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but better understood as human flourishing or well-being. Eudaimonia isn't a feeling or emotional state. It's a way of living that actualizes the best possibilities of human nature. It's what we would call a life well lived, a life that achieves excellence in the distinctively human capacities. But what are these distinctively human capacities? Aristotle's answer reveals his profound understanding of human nature. Like plants, humans have nutritive functions. We grow, reproduce, maintain ourselves. Like animals, we have sensitive functions. We perceive, feel, move through space. But uniquely, humans have rational functions. We think, deliberate, choose, create meaning, form communities based on shared understanding rather than mere instinct. Eudaimonia then involves the excellent performance of all these functions, but especially the rational ones that make us distinctively human. It's not enough to survive or even to feel pleasure. We flourish only when we actualize our capacity for rational activity in both its theoretical and practical dimensions. This leads to one of Aristotle's most important insights. Virtue, arete, is not about following rules, but about becoming the kind of person who naturally acts well. Virtue is excellence of character, a stable disposition to feel, desire, and act in ways that promote human flourishing, both in ourselves and in our communities. But here's what makes Aristotelian ethics so sophisticated. He recognizes that eudaimonia can't be achieved in isolation. Humans are political animals. We naturally live in communities and can achieve our highest potential only through relationships with others. The person who tries to be self-sufficient is either a beast or a god, not a human being. This means that individual ethics and political philosophy are inseparable. We can't flourish as individuals unless we live in communities that support and encourage virtue. And we can't have good communities unless they're composed of people who are developing excellence of character. Moreover, Aristotle insists that eudaimonia requires external goods as well as inner virtue. You can't flourish if you're constantly worried about survival, if you lack friends, if you live in an unjust society, if you don't have opportunities to exercise your distinctively human capacities. Virtue is necessary for flourishing, but not sufficient. We also need what he calls the goods of fortune. This realistic acknowledgement that circumstances matter doesn't lead to fatalism, but to practical wisdom. We can't control everything that happens to us, but we can develop the kind of character that responds well to whatever circumstances we face. And we can work to create communities that provide more people with more opportunities for flourishing. The golden mean, virtue as excellence athletes in training, musicians practicing, craftspeople perfecting their skills. How do we become good people? Aristotle's answer challenges both ancient and modern assumptions about morality. Virtue isn't something we're born with, and it's not achieved through following abstract rules. Instead, virtue is like skill. It's developed through practice, guided by understanding, aimed at excellence. Consider courage, one of Aristotle's paradigmatic virtues. The courageous person isn't someone who feels no fear. That would be recklessness, or perhaps pathology. Nor is courage simply following a rule like always stand and fight. Instead, courage is the disposition to feel appropriate fear in dangerous situations and to act well despite that fear. This leads to Aristotle's famous doctrine of the mean. Most moral virtues represent a mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage is the mean between cowardice, deficiency of confidence in facing danger, and recklessness, excess of confidence. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and wasteful spending. Pride is the mean between vanity and self-deprecation. But the mean isn't a mathematical average. It's what Aristotle calls the mean relative to us. What's appropriate for this person in this situation given their role, relationships, and circumstances? A soldier and a civilian face different kinds of dangers and have different responsibilities. What counts as courage differs accordingly. This contextual understanding of virtue prevents Aristotelian ethics from degenerating into rigid rule-following. Good action requires practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to perceive what's really at stake in particular situations and to choose the response that best serves human flourishing. Practical wisdom can't be reduced to technical expertise or theoretical knowledge. It's more like the wisdom of an experienced doctor who can diagnose not just by following algorithms, but by recognizing patterns, understanding contexts, and seeing connections that less experienced practitioners miss. But here's what makes this approach to virtue truly profound. Aristotle realizes that we become virtuous by acting virtuously, but we can't act virtuously until we've developed virtue. This apparent circularity is actually the key to understanding moral development. We begin by imitating virtuous actions, often because we're guided by parents, teachers, or social expectations. Initially, we might act courageously because we're told it's right, or because we want approval. But through repeated practice in acting courageously, we gradually develop the internal dispositions that make courage natural and spontaneous. Eventually, we reach a point where we act courageously not because of external incentives, but because we've become the kind of people who naturally respond courageously to dangerous situations. The virtue has become second nature, so deeply ingrained that it operates automatically, like a skilled musician's ability to play complex pieces without conscious attention to finger placement. This process requires what Aristotle calls moral education, not just learning about virtue theoretically, but practicing virtue under the guidance of those who have already developed excellent character. We learn virtue by living in communities where virtue is modeled, expected, and supported. Friendship and community. Various forms of human relationships, community gatherings, people engaged in shared activities. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle devotes more space to friendship than to any other single topic. This isn't because he's particularly sentimental, but because he recognizes something that modern individualistic cultures often miss. Friendship is essential to human flourishing in a way that goes far beyond personal satisfaction. Aristotle identifies three kinds of friendship, each serving different functions in human life. Friendships of utility are based on mutual benefit, business relationships, political alliances, arrangements where people cooperate because each gains something valuable from the interaction. These friendships are necessary for practical life, but remain somewhat superficial because they last only as long as the mutual benefit continues. Friendships of pleasure are based on shared enjoyment. People who like spending time together because they find each other's company delightful. These friendships are more personal than utility-based relationships, but still depend on circumstances that can change. Young people often form such friendships, but they tend to be temporary because people's tastes and interests evolve. But the highest form of friendship, what Aristotle calls perfect friendship, is based on mutual appreciation of each other's character. Perfect friends admire each other's virtue and want what's best for each other for the other person's own sake, not for any benefit it brings to themselves. Perfect friendship is rare because it requires several conditions that are difficult to achieve. Both people must be virtuous, since you can't appreciate excellent character in another person unless you've developed some excellence yourself. Both must know each other well, since character is revealed only through extended interaction across various circumstances. And both must have enough time and energy to invest in the deep mutual care that perfect friendship requires. But when these conditions are met, perfect friendship becomes one of the highest forms of human relationship. Perfect friends serve as other selves. They help each other see their own blind spots, encourage each other's growth toward virtue, and provide the deep understanding that makes individual self-knowledge possible. This analysis reveals something crucial about Aristotelian ethics. Moral development is fundamentally social. We don't become virtuous in isolation, but through relationships that challenge us, support us, and provide models of excellent character. The person without friends lacks something essential for human flourishing, regardless of their other achievements. But Aristotle's understanding of friendship extends beyond personal relationships to encompass what we might call civic friendship, the bonds that hold political communities together. Citizens in a well-ordered polis share a kind of friendship based on their common commitment to justice and their mutual recognition as fellow rational beings capable of participating in shared governance. This civic dimension of friendship helps explain why Aristotle sees politics as a branch of ethics rather than a separate domain. Political institutions aren't just mechanisms for preventing conflict or maximizing preferences. They're arrangements that either support or undermine the conditions necessary for human flourishing. A good political community, like a good friendship, is based on mutual recognition of each other's dignity and shared commitment to each other's flourishing. Citizens care about the common good, not just because it serves their individual interests, but because they recognize themselves as part of a larger whole whose well-being is inseparable from their own. This understanding of civic friendship has profound implications for how we think about democracy, law, education, and social policy. Political arrangements should be evaluated not just by their efficiency or their protection of individual rights, but by their tendency to encourage or discourage the kinds of relationships that make human flourishing possible. Political arrangements should be evaluated not just by their efficiency or their protection of individual rights, but by their tendency to encourage or discourage the kinds of relationships that make human flourishing possible. The nature of the polis ancient Greek city-states, agorascenes, citizens in democratic deliberation, man is by nature a political animal. This famous declaration from Aristotle's Politics isn't just an observation about human behavior, it's a fundamental claim about what we are and what we need to flourish. To understand why Aristotle considers politics a natural science rather than mere power competition, we must grasp his vision of the polis as the institutional expression of human rationality. The polis, usually translated as city-state, isn't simply a collection of individuals who happen to live in the same geographic area. It's a community of rational beings who come together to pursue the good life in common. Unlike mere alliances or trading partnerships, the polis exists not just to meet material needs, but to enable its members to actualize their distinctively human capacities. Aristotle traces the natural development of political community through three stages. First comes the household, based on the biological necessities of reproduction and survival. Then comes the village, an alliance of households that can provide security and meet expanded needs. Finally, emerges the polis, which transcends mere necessity to make possible the pursuit of excellence and meaning. But here's what makes Aristotelian political theory so sophisticated. While the polis emerges last chronologically, it's first in terms of purpose and value. Just as the whole oak tree provides the meaning that explains the acorn's development, the polis provides the context that gives meaning to households and villages. We understand the parts by reference to the whole they serve. This teleological understanding leads to a paradox that's central to human existence. Although we're born into families and learn to speak before we can participate in political life, our nature is most fully realized only when we become citizens capable of deliberating about justice and contributing to communal self-governance. The person who can't participate in political community is either a beast, driven only by appetite and incapable of rational discourse, or a god, completely self-sufficient and needing nothing from others. Everyone in between these extremes is political by nature, meaning that we can achieve our highest human potential only through life in a genuine polis. But what makes a community a genuine polis, rather than mere aggregation? Aristotle's answer reveals his profound understanding of human sociality. A polis exists when people share not just space or economic interests, but a common understanding of justice. Citizens aren't just people who happen to live under the same government. They're people who recognize each other as equals in their capacity for rational deliberation about the common good. This shared understanding of justice isn't imposed from outside, but emerges through the process of political participation itself. Citizens develop their sense of justice by actually engaging in the activities of citizenship, deliberating about laws, serving in public roles, taking responsibility for communal decisions. This means that the polis is both natural and artificial. Natural because it fulfills essential human capacities. Artificial because it must be created and maintained through conscious human effort. We're political animals, not because we instinctively form governments, like bees forming hives, but because we have the rational capacity to create institutions that serve human flourishing. Justice and the rule of law, ancient courts, scales of justice, legal scrolls and documents. What is justice? This question drives Aristotle's political philosophy because he recognizes that without a shared understanding of justice, no genuine political community is possible. But his analysis of justice reveals complexities that challenge both ancient and modern assumptions about law, rights, and social organization. Aristotle distinguishes between two fundamental forms of justice: distributive and corrective. Distributive justice concerns how goods, honors, and burdens should be allocated among members of a community. Corrective justice concerns how to respond when someone has been wronged, how to restore proper relationships after they've been disrupted. Distributive justice operates according to the principle of proportional equality. Equals should be treated equally, but unequals may be treated unequally in proportion to their relevant differences. This sounds straightforward until you realize that everything depends on what counts as a relevant difference and what constitutes equal treatment. Should political offices be distributed based on wealth, birth, virtue, or popular choice? Should economic goods be allocated according to need, merit, contribution, or equal shares? Different conceptions of justice give different answers because they emphasize different aspects of human nature and social relationships. Aristotle argues that the best answer depends on the purpose of the institution in question. Athletic prizes should go to those who perform best athletically. Medical care should be distributed based on health needs. Political authority should be allocated to those most capable of promoting the common good. The key is matching the criterion of distribution to the end the institution is supposed to serve. But corrective justice operates differently. When someone has been wronged, the goal isn't to reward merit or meet needs, but to restore the proper relationship between the parties. If I steal from you, justice requires that I return what was taken, plus appropriate compensation for the harm done. The focus is on restoring balance rather than achieving some ideal distribution. This distinction has profound implications for how we think about legal systems. Law serves both distributive and corrective functions, but its primary purpose is to embody the community's shared understanding of justice in institutional form. Good laws don't just prevent conflict, they educate citizens in virtue by making just behavior habitual and expected. Aristotle's most revolutionary insight about law concerns its relationship to political authority. The rule of law is superior to the rule of even the best individuals because law embodies reason without passion. Individual rulers, no matter how wise or virtuous, are subject to emotions and personal interests that can distort their judgment. But good laws represent the community's collective reasoning about justice, refined through experience and deliberation. However, law can't cover every possible situation. There will always be cases that fall between legal categories or circumstances the lawmakers didn't anticipate. This is where the virtue of equity, epieikeia, becomes essential. Equity isn't opposed to justice, but represents justice's application to particular circumstances that go beyond what explicit rules can capture. The person who exercises equity doesn't violate the law, but applies its spirit to situations the letter of the law doesn't adequately address. This requires practical wisdom, the ability to see what the law is trying to achieve and how best